Hello, I'm Baroness Camilla de la Renard of the Barony of the Flame in the Middle Kingdom, and in this class I'm going to talk about some of the tricks and techniques that I use when I make Monmouth caps. Now, why would you want to make a Monmouth cap? Well, because it was the cap of the average guy for a 300 or 400 year period, and the two best sources of information on this are the Kirsty Buckland article that appeared in Costume in 1979, and I was fortunate enough to have mine autographed, and then the hat and cap section in this book, For the Mast, Life and Death Aboard the Mary Rose, which was also written by Kirsty Buckland, or the cap and hat section was. Now, even though Kirsty Buckland wrote about hats and caps for this book, there was not a Monmouth cap found on the Mary Rose, which is odd, but that's what we have. Now, what makes a Monmouth cap a Monmouth cap? Well, the only surviving cap that can be considered a true Monmouth cap is in the Monmouth Historical Society Museum, or whatever it's called, in Wales, and this is what it looks like. It is brown, and it has a loop here at the bottom and a small button here at the top. And it has some sort of edging here, and no one is ever quite certain how this edging is formed. So what do we see and what don't we see? Well, we don't see any ribbing, because at this time, and like I said, it's about 300 or 400 year time span on these caps, ribbing wasn't known. They knew about the pearl stitch definitively after about 1550, but the evidence before that is not known, if it existed. So, what does Kirsty Buckland have to say about the Monmouth cap? It's round, brown, and topped with a small button. It's knitted in coarse, thick, 2-ply wool, felted, thickened, and shorn. It may have been dyed after or during felting. The most noticeable feature is the shape, which is achieved with mathematical care and simplicity. Plain knitting in multiples of 10s and 20s. Very simple. Head-hugging, helmet-shaped pattern, suggesting that that part of it was important. It was small, it's only 8 inches deep, it's 22 inches around, and only 59 stitches in circumference there where the brim joins the crown. And that makes it roughly 2.5 stitches to the inch, which is 1 stitch to the centimeter after felting. So the gauge on this before it was felted must have been enormous. But like I said, there were a lot of them made for a very long time, because it's mentioned as early as the 1340s in capping guild statutes, and as late as the 1620s when the packing list for Plymouth Plantation was issued, and a Monmouth cap was on the list of the things to bring to the New World. So what does a modern Monmouth cap look like? Well, this is what mine looks like. It's round, it's dark burgundy because I got the wool very cheap. It has a button on top. I'm going to show you how to do that part. It's got an edging, and it's got a loop with 14 stitches on it. Buckland's very specific about that. And the brim is turned under. Now, when people make this, sometimes they torture the information, knit the cap, knit the brim as a separate piece, then sew it on and sew it on. No, don't torture yourself. There's a much easier way to do it that I will show you. So what does it look like when it's recreated for modern educational historical purposes. This is what it looks like. This is from the National Army Museum or the Imperial War Museum in London, I forget which. This was on a mannequin display of the English Civil War, and you can see it's very coarsely knit. The brim is turned up. You can almost see a decrease here, and you can see the loop. You can also see a tiny little button here. Some people make buttons in different ways, so whoever knit this for the Army Museum or Imperial War Museum left it as a tiny little knob like on a beret. This is a slightly different view. You can see the decreases on the cap a little clearer. So how do you get started? Well, first you find a needle and the yarn that's going to give you the gauge you want. Now, don't pay too much for needles. I take the easy way out and I go to the dowel rod section of the store and I find a dowel rod that fits on my needle gauge. So I buy the dowel rods. There are certain big box craft stores that sell bags of dowel rod pre-cut to a foot long, so all I have to do is put the ends in a pencil sharpener and buff it up a little bit so it doesn't snag. Maybe just put a light coat of clear shoe polish on it and you're good to go. I cannot stand it when needle manufacturers sell double-pointed needles in stubby little sets that are too short and the stitches fall off and people get discouraged and they don't want to knit because their stitches fall off and they're overpriced. So if you buy dowel rods, a needle may only cost you $1, and you won't care if you drop it or not. So get yourself a needle gauge, find the right size dowel rod, find the yarn that's going to give you the gauge you need, and away you go. And how do you get started? Well, for this purpose, the easiest cast on is a knit on cast on, which I'm going to demonstrate. So I start with a slip knot. The ever popular slip knot. Now I realize this is not quite the focus of the class, but some people aren't familiar with all this jargon, and I don't want to be one of those people that teaches too fast and uses too much jargon. So I've got the first stitch on the left needle. I put the right needle in there. I knit it, and if I was just knitting I would slip it off, but I'm not going to. I put it on the left needle, and of course it's being a little cranky because I'm on camera. And then now I've got 2 on the left needle. I want 3. I knit, but instead of pulling that stitch off, I put it on the left needle. And I like this cast on for this cap because it gives you a nice loose cast on that you're going to need here in a minute. So you just continue until you've got the number of stitches that you need. Now, when you get this cap started, you cast on your 60 stitches and you spread them over 3 needles. Then you knit a total of 8 rows. So I've knit, you start here, you knit 8 rows, maybe you do a decrease on row 8, row 9, start bringing it in a little bit. Then you knit another 8 rows for a total of 16 rows, and now you're ready for the first magic trick. Now you'll need to do this for this cap because if you just leave the edge plain, it's going to curl. 400 years of gravity doesn't stop these things from curling, trust me. Now, if you could come around here again, I will show you the magic trick. All right, here's the first 8 rows, or here's the first 16 rows. You see how this bottom edge is curling and curling and curling. I don't want that. I want this nice folded edge. So I fold it together. This is why you want the loose cast on. I put it through the working stitch, the needle through the working stitch. I put the needle through the cast on loop, and I knit them both together. I don't have to knit 2 separate pieces and sew it here and sew it here. It's knit together. Put it through the working stitch, put it through the cast on edge, and slide it off. And again, through the working stitch, through the cast on edge, knit it, one more time, through the working stitch, through the cast on edge, knit and knit. That's all you do. So now the edge is turned under, it's secure, it's not going to fall apart. You have a double thickness of wool around the pulse points in your head. Now remember, this was before central heating. Parts of the medieval age were a mini ice age. They wanted 2 layers of wool around some of the pulse points in their head to keep warm. Now, we don't always need this in our modern day and age, but then they did, and they were glad to have it. So, that's trick 1. This gets you up to this point. Then, as you progress, you're going to knit about 6 inches, decreasing, say, like once every needle, about every 5 rows or so, whatever you feel comfortable with, till you get to a depth of about 6 inches. Remember, the total length on the original that we saw was 8. So this is 5 inches, so you need to start decreasing about here-ish a little more often. And I just use like a knit 2 together, knit 1 row, knit 1, knit 2 together, knit 1 row, knit 2 together. And that will generally get me down to about 5 or 6 stitches, and then I'm ready to make the button. Now, my method for making a button differs from someone else's. Everyone has a preferred system. Mine makes a slightly hard button, but in case you want to button it through a sallet or a spun top, this is what you need. So I've gotten to the point here that I'm ready to do that. I've done the Monmouth cap. I've done the 16 rows, knit the brim together, knit another 6 inches, or I knit to the depth of about 6 inches, 7 inches. Then I did my decreases, and now I'm down to 7 inches, or 7 stitches. And I've knit that for about an inch or 2, and now I'm ready to get it off the needle. This is a nice little wooden needle a friend gifted me. So all I'm going to do is run this needle through these stitches. There we go, there's one needle out. Then here's the other needle out. So there's all my stitches, my last 7 stitches. and you think, oh no, it looks obscene. What are you going to do with that? All right, I'm going to pull this shut like a drawstring, and then I'm going to take it down through the center and out through the base of that stem I created. And I'm going to pull and pull and pull until it squashes down. And to help it keep that shape, I'm going to weave the needle through the stitches at the base, and that's going to help keep that pulled down. Can you tell I've done this before? Now, is this going to be the perfect cap for everyone from 1349 up to 1620? No, because most modern men will not want to wear wool, even if it's been washed and felted and it's softer than it started out. They won't want to wear wool between Memorial Day and Labor Day. Now, if you are in the northern parts of the known world, maybe you will, but not everyone will. So now I have my button. I just take this, put it through, then I whip stitch it through here a couple of times and cut it off. As it is worn, it will felt, even if you don't felt it, and it'll stay in place. Now, for the edge stitching on the brim that we see here, where'd it go? Nope, that's not it. There it is. So to recreate the edge that you see here, what you can do, that would be the period way, because you could cheat and crochet, but you don't want to do that. You simply get however many strands of yarn that you used for the body of the hat. In this case, it was 2 strands of yarn on this one. And you do a sewn chain stitch. So I come through the previous loop. I go through, say, about a stitch, and see how I'm leaving a loop there. So I just pull that through, but not too tight, and there you go. This stitch can be found in most embroidery books, so it's not that difficult to find. So one more time, and then I'll show you how you can make the loop with this method. So I'm holding the loop here so it doesn't tangle. Whoops, there we go. And to make the loop that you see there, you can just do it kind of in the air. So you come through the loop like you've done before, but I'm not going through the brim. Now I'm not going to pull this tight, so it's freestanding from the brim. So you would do that 14 times, because buckling is quite specific on that. And then you would just reattach it and go on. Now the other way you could do that looks more like the one we saw in the museum photo. It looks more like this. So what I think they have done to recreate this cap, and this goes back to the Dura Europus fragment in Syria, they have done a buttonhole stitch. So this is AD 300 in Syria, so this stitch goes back that far. So when they were recreating this cap, they've done the chain here along the brim, and then to make the loop, they've been doing the chain stitch like I did with the other example. And then at some point they did a loop around here a couple of times to give it a base to work on. And now they're doing a buttonhole stitch. And when I saw this in the museum, I nearly fell down the stairs. I was that flabbergasted. It's like, of course, it's all so obvious now. So this is just a buttonhole stitch, and you have to kind of hold it in place as it slides into position, and that's all it is. And it gives you that edge that you see right there. So I'm holding the loop. And people think, oh, it'll take so long to knit this, it'll take so long to knit this. This is one of the quicker projects that you can knit, because when I was knitting caps to barter, I could do about a cap and a half a day. Of course, I wasn't felting them, but I could knit a cap and a half a day. And remember, these were probably semi-professionally made for money. This was made to earn your keep. So you get the idea. If you have an issue with this, contact one of your friends that does embroidery or sews their buttonholes by hand. Say, show me a buttonhole stitch, and they can help you out. So those are the two ways you could do that without crocheting and cheating. Crochet is not, period. I hate to be that blunt, but there is no documentary evidence before I don't know even when for crochet. So you do that 14 times, there's your loop, and you go on with the chained edge. So to repeat, for Monmouth caps, you cast on about 60 stitches at 2.5 stitches to 1 inch, and do about 16 rows. You can decrease once during those 16 rows if you want. Knit the brim together, then knit to about 6 inches deep, start your decrease, get down to about 6-7 stitches, it doesn't matter. Close that off, put the needle down through here, come out the stem, pull it tight, tighter than I did here, closer to this. Go around the base, tie that off, you're done. Then come around to the base, the brim, the fold, pick your method, chain stitch along the edge, then either do it in air like this, which looks crocheted when you do it, or do it like this with a buttonhole stitch, which imitates what was seen on a mannequin in the National Army Museum in London. I'm going to assume they wouldn't have put it on there if they didn't trust the source. Now, if you want to do a Thrum cap, the shaping is pretty much the same except for a couple of things. Now, Thrum caps are quite a chore to document because they the artistic evidence conflicts with the artifact evidence and conflicts with, none of it works. There's no one definitive thrum cap anywhere. There's several hints and suggestions, and they're mentioned in a poem next to Monmouth caps. There is a poem that exists, and it's called The Ballad of the Caps, and it was written in the mid-16th century, and it talks about all the different hats people wear and what they signify. And it includes the verse that mentions Monmouth caps and Thrum caps. The soldiers that the Monmouth wear on castle tops their ensigns rear. The seaman with his Thrum doth stand on higher parts than all the land. For any cap, whate'er it be, is still the sign of some degree. Now, some people have it in their heads that this means that Thrum caps were worn only by men, and they were worn a lot by seamen, and they were made out of red and worn by the ship's carpenter so that everyone else could spot the ship's carpenter. All of that is very, very, very squishy. Shakespeare mentions Thrum caps in The Merry Wives of Windsor. When Falstaff is being snuck out of a building, he needs to make an escape, and the two women are discussing how they're going to do that, and they say, oh, my aunt's a big woman. We'll get one of her shawls, and we'll get her Thrum cap. So, we have Shakespearean evidence that Thrum caps were worn by women. So what do Thrum caps look like? They look shaggy. Everyone assumes this means that Thrum caps were knit, and then they had all these thrums, these weaving cutoffs woven into them. I personally think that is a little squishy and hard to prove, because there again, these are being made to sell for a profit. You've got to be able to grind them out as fast as you can, or you aren't going to be making Thrum caps anymore, because you're going to starve to death. And here again, they have to be made out of wool because they're going to need felt. Yeah, I know, I just contradicted myself saying we don't know that much, and then say, well, it has to be this way. But I decided to make a Thrum cap because I had an example I simply had to do. This is from a Dutch market scene of Christ and the woman taken in adultery. Now, the whole parable thing is in the background. Christ and the woman taken in adultery. Way in the background, there's this huge market scene in the foreground, and this gentleman is wearing kind of a short-crowned, fuzzy cap. And everyone thinks, oh, Thrum caps have this very tall crown, and they're very furry, they're very shaggy. Not necessarily. You see that this one has a short crown, and it's fuzzy, but it's not furry. But everyone thinks that Thrum caps look like this. They're very tall, and they look shaggy. Like I said, the evidence is squishy. But I had to make this one because this gentleman is obviously one of my husband's ancestors. So I got to make that one. And how did I do it? Well, I started off with the 8 rows, and I just knitted these 8 rows. No thrumming. And then I did 8 more rows with thrums, knit it together, then continued, and then just decreased but no button.
Show those first 8 rows again.
Remember, the first 8 rows are plain, no thrumming, because you don't want that rubbing on your forehead. Then after 8 rows, on row 9, you start putting your thrums in. And now comes the magic trick when I show you how to do a thrum. This technique has been reintroduced to knitters recently. A lady wrote a book about what she calls a loop stitch, and I thought, oh, she can't have invented the wheel. And sure enough, I went through Barbara Walker's Knitting Patterns books, and I found a version of this. So she did not invent the wheel, and this just answered the question of how a cap was thrummed so simply. It just struck me that it's the simplest explanation for a thrum. And now if the cameraman will go around to my right shoulder, I will show you how you thrum. Are we good?
Yes.
Okay, here's how you thrum a cap. So I'm just going to knit this stitch plain to get it out of the way. Alright, so you knit the stitch, and let's get this over some good contrast. So I've knit the stitch, I've got the new stitch on the right needle, the old stitch on the left needle. I'm going to bring the yarn between the needles around my thumb, just catch it like that, and then back between the needles, knit in the old stitch again, slip it off, pass the first old stitch over the newest stitch, boom, there's my loop, and it's locked, it's not coming out. Again, knit, but don't slide it off the needle. Bring it between the needles, catch it with your thumb, bring it back through the needles, knit in the old stitch again, slide the old stitch off. So now you've got 2 stitches. You don't want an increase. So I pick that stitch up. There, it's locked. Now I'm going to show you what happens. There we go. All right. One more time. All right, I've knit the stitch. The new stitch is on the right needle, old stitch is on the left needle. Bring the yarn through around the thumb, back between there, knit it again, there, and it's locked forever and ever. Now, if you were going to make this out of wool, and believe me, wool is best, then you would run this through the washing machine, and it would come out looking somewhat like this. If you wanted to shear it before you felted it, it might look more like a classical thrum cap. This one didn't get sheared before it got felted, or washed anyway. And you can see the texture. You couldn't confuse it with cut off ends. And when you make it, you're going to have to do a swatch first to find out how much it's going to shrink. So swatches are generally 20 stitches and 20 rows. Then you see how many stitches you have to the horizontal and vertical inch. And then you would launder that, see how much it's going to shrink, and go from there. Yes, it's math. Knitting is math, believe it or not. Now, is the person you're wearing or knitting this for going to wear it all the time? Probably not, because here again, it's wool. Unless he's very dedicated in his persona, or you live in the northern climes, it may be too warm for him. Because the texture on the inside's a little thicker too than the Monmouth cap. You can see it's kind of bumpy compared to the Monmouth cap, which is the only texture comes from this being the pearl side. It doesn't come from the added texture of having the bump of the thrum on it. So again, these are, believe it or not, a good way to start knitting, because you don't have to do anything complicated. No matter how you make it, it's probably going to fit someone you know with a pre-1500 persona, which is a good time frame for this, because they were universal. We're talking England to Iceland to Virginia to Massachusetts. Monmouth caps went everywhere. Thrum caps, we don't know, but I had to make this one once I saw how to do this stitch, and I saw that one of my husband's ancestors obviously wore one. So remember, don't pay too much for knitting needles. Take your needle gauge to the dowel rod section and find the right size. If you're going to knit something period, please knit it in wool. If you're making an upper class item, wool or silk, the jury's kind of out on linen. Have fun with it and keep knitting.